Welcome to another episode of B2B Marketing Futures. Today we are diving into a topic that every marketing leader thinks about, but few get right: cross-functional alignment. What happens when marketing, sales, product, and operations actually operate as one unified go-to-market team? And what's stopping more companies from getting there? To unpack that, I'm joined by three brilliant guests, and I would love to hear a little bit about you and your background. So maybe Will, would you like to give a sentence on yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Joaquin. And hello, everyone. My name is Will Perlman. I'm currently running Will Perlman Consulting, I'm a principal consultant there. We're like a boutique agency that helps basically with everyone across all business processes. So, you kind of start with the marketing funnel, moving through sales, customer success, data and analytics, and the operations side of the business. And that's kind of how really you grow. We call that running the business engine, right? It's kind of that secondary product that's the business product beyond the product you actually sell. So yeah, a lot of experience. I've worked at Fortune 500s and startups and everything in between throughout my career, in-house and as a consultant. So yeah, very excited to be here and share some insights.
Thank you so much, Will. Shannon, welcome.
Yes, thanks, Joaquin. Hi, I'm Shannon Richardson. I'm a director of performance marketing at Sage Software. I've been at Sage for 10 years, and our marketing organization has gone through a lot of transformation in those 10 years. So ups and downs, highs and lows. We've been through it all, but we're constantly evolving to kind of meet market demand. And I'm really excited to be here to talk about how we can do better.
Thank you so much, Shannon. And Jasmine, welcome.
Thank you for having me. So my name is Jasmine Aldini. I'm leading the marketing operations team at one of our divisions at Infineon in the semiconductor industry. I was in several marketing roles in the last 30 years, from having my own company over B2C, B2B, so everything across the line. And I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for those introductions. So let's kick things off by imagining the ideal, okay? If a go-to-market team were operating at its absolute best, with sales, marketing, product, and operations truly aligned around a shared understanding of the customer, what would that look and feel like? What behaviors, structures, or outcomes would you expect to see?
I can jump in. Yeah, I think that's the dream, I think, for any sort of organization. When you're all working in unison towards kind of one particular goal, I think that's how you succeed. I know in our case, performance marketing, it's all about hitting the number, driving revenue, and that's obviously what the business wants. So when everybody's working together, everybody knows their role and what they're supposed to do and how that handoff happens, and how we all work together. I think it creates a really great synergy, a really great environment that really motivates people to want to win and to want to show up at work every day.
Yeah. And Shannon, just kind of, you mentioned that synergy. I think one of the important parts that I've seen in my experience is it's a lot about governance as well, making sure that each team understands not just what the other team is doing, but they kind of have their own processes to make and adhere to them to make sure that they really are contributing to that larger picture. I think sometimes when you're trying to work across cross-functional teams, especially in larger organizations, people kind of get specialized in their work and they're not always informed of the big picture. So I think a lot of times it's the responsibility of the leadership team to make sure that they're informing those teams of, hey, if you're in sales, you've got your numbers, right? You've got your number of meetings or deals you have to close, but you also have to understand what the marketing side is doing to bring you those warm leads and kind of see those efforts that might not be in your pipeline today, but know that, hey, that what marketing is doing today is going to be in your pipeline tomorrow, and understand where those leads are coming from, whether it's a new channel or it's something that's, tried and true. Likewise, sales needs to understand what type of customers are coming down the pipe, or not sales, sorry, I'm customer success. So they know how to actually, talk to them once they're ready to onboard a product or start using your service.
Yeah, I think this is exactly one of the crucial points that you just mentioned, because if you don't have this clarified and it's also simplified, because I worked not only now, also before in very big organizations. And if you just keep your silo and your own processes and just department KPIs and so on, you will never succeed because you don't understand the contribution to the full picture. And I think this is also, if you really agree on, let's say, at least on a high level base joint targets, this is for me the key to success. So everybody really needs to understand it. And then you work towards a towards a joint target. And we really just try to analyze these factors, right? We wanted to understand which teams are these high performance teams. And what we found out is that where do we see this high performance? Always in task force teams. And why? Because you have a clear focus, right? You don't care about the department KPI in this moment. You really care just about this clear focus, this clear target, your stuff are purpose-based, and everybody trusts each other. I think this is also something which I came across often. You really need to trust the other functions. Otherwise, you try to do everything on your own, and then you will not succeed together, and you cannot be a high performance team.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a perfect timing. Our organization right now, we're going through our next year's fiscal planning, and we're deciding on targets. And it's, we come together as a team. We have product marketing, we have sales, we have the SDR, BDR team all together in a room. And so we're agreeing on this together out of the gate. And I think that's what really helps to kind of set everybody up for success, is because, again, you can't do planning in silo with these different teams. You have to all come together and understand what your part is, and then how you're going to achieve that. And everybody needs to accept, this is going to be the targets. This is what we're going to. How do we feel comfortable? Roadblocks, risks, any concerns, and then we can kind of work through those and address those so that everybody's kind of on the same page at the start of the year.
Yeah, and that awareness about targets, I think, is very important, not just for the individual teams. Like Yasmin, you were talking about how you have those task force kind of teams that specialize, but making sure that they're aware of the other team's goals, right? And how they're being measured and how that aligns to the bigger picture. I think that's one area that some companies do really well, other companies not so much, and understanding what those metrics are and making sure that from the back end perspective in the database, you have the database properly being served to each team, right? You don't want to flood the team with everything, right? Because sometimes databases are huge. There can be billions and billions of data points, but you also don't want to underserve them and say, just keep them in that silo, like we discussed a second ago. You want to give them some visibility, and finding that right balance. I think that's part of the job of kind of overseeing that big picture of how is that whole operation running across the board to keep that balance of, people being aware of all the other teams, what's going on, but also having enough, kind of perspective and scope to kind of say, hey, I'm focused in on what I need to accomplish. That's part of this bigger picture.
I think this is really the big point. So what I'm working for a few years now but simplified OKR schemes. And I think this helps a lot because you really understand what is your contribution to the high level target. And this is the most important thing. So for example, sometimes we had discussions like, okay, my target is to generate leads. Yes, but in which context? So if you don't contribute then to the bigger goal, the lead cannot help you. And I think this is the most important thing. So you really need to understand how this is interconnected. So if we have, regardless of the organization, 500 billion leads, but at the end we don't have revenue and it's not the right target group, we will not succeed, right? So I think this is really the point. You need to bring the puzzle parts together, and if we all strive for the right objectives, then we will be successful together in each function.
When you build those OKRs, are OKRs only for one part of the organization, for one team, or are cross OKRs? Can you tell us a little bit about the best practices when building and when measuring OKRs?
In my experience, so there's the OKRs, usually when you're managing them on that quarterly basis, we try to keep individual goals, right, for the team or just the individual at the company, but it has to fit into a larger organizational goal, right? So there might be specific tasks or projects or just goals in general that you want to put in that from the individual or team level, but then you want to keep like a high level initiative at the company that ties into something cross-functionally, cross departments. So there might be 4 or 5 big things a quarter. One thing I've seen when I was working at Snowflake was there was a big migration project for the website. And as part of that project, right, that's a huge goal, right? So we want to move the content section this quarter, let's say, of the website, right? And the Fortune 500 organizations, that can be tens of thousands of pieces of content and landing pages and operational processes behind it. So each part of the team has those individual goals of, hey, I need to move this section or that section, or I need to rebuild this, or I need to develop that functionality if you're on the development team. But it falls into that larger goal of, hey, we're moving the content section of the website to this new platform. So there are those types of elements that, you have those smaller tasks that fall into that larger goal within the organization. And I think having not just those tasks, but the visibility into it, and then having those cross-functional meetings where there might be kind of like departmental all hands or cross-functional teams where maybe like, I know most organizations, if your sales and marketing team aren't meeting regularly, at least once a month, that's a problem to me, right? That's a red flag if you're not having that, communication between those teams. So I think kind of laying out as an organization this quarter or this half of the fiscal year, we have this goal, we need to accomplish this, or this 3-phase project over the next 3 quarters, and then breaking it down in kind of those subtasks for the team and then the micro tasks, if you will, for the actual individuals, contributors on those teams. And Yasmin, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would say exactly as you just said. I think the most important thing is to agree on the high level company objectives. And if we know that, what we want to achieve, and we have the same understanding, I think this is also a very important thing. It should not be too complex. It needs to be simple. It needs to be clear. And then you can contribute to this. So for example, sometimes I think especially marketing teams have partially a hard time to understand what is their contribution to revenue, for example, because they are so at the very beginning of the funnel often in their self-understanding. And it's crucial that they are part of this revenue contribution, right? So they need to understand, what can I do to drive it? What is my portion? Exactly as on the sales side, it's really important to understand if you don't have any marketing activities on the other hand, we will not grow our funnel, right? So we are not in the 90s where we just travel around the world and visit customers. And I think this, to make it very black and white, right? But I think this is really important, and to measure it, this I think is also important without exaggerating it, because this is this really important part of balance. So, and I think in the targets is of course important to make it clear, to define 1 or 2 KPIs, how you want to measure it, and not to mistake it with tracking, right? So in the target, it's totally sufficient to have clear scope, not to have a target which is, 1 page long, but to have a target which is very clear. And on the other side, then tracking using analytics data and so on to understand what's going on further.
And on that point, I think you made some good points, Yasmin. I think, again, in kind of our transformation at Sage, we were field marketers, then we were campaign managers, and then now we've changed our marketing organization to performance marketing. And that's really, really key, because it tells us kind of what we can work on and what to focus on, because we are performance driven. And so all of our goals are tied to revenue, are tied to very specific, you're driving this many MQLs, this many SQOs, that generates this much pipeline. We're responsible for, 80% of driving that. Sales generates, 20% of that on their own. And so then when it comes down to making decisions on, what we're going to do from a marketing campaign perspective, we all have to stop and think and go, is this tactic, is this channel, is this going to help me hit this SQO target, this pipeline target? And then it becomes really easy to then be able to kind of weed out the things that you don't think are going to perform. But on the back of that, being a performance marketer, your analytics has to be dead on, your reporting has to be dead on, right? So I'm looking at numbers and performance every single day. And back to your point, Will, we meet with sales and marketing at least probably 2 times a week. And we go through, we have a set format. Here's what we're doing. Here's our performance from an MQL perspective from marketing. Here are the activities coming up. BDR team, here's what they're seeing and calls they're qualifying. And then sales, this is what they're doing. And so I think it's really great to constantly have that communication and that collaboration with the full team, so everybody knows how we're moving forward to that goal at the end of the day. Because if you're not talking with sales on a regular basis, then that's, I think, where a lot of friction, a lot of tension comes in, of, marketing's not helping sales, and, sales isn't working my leads. But if you're constantly in communication with each other, I think it just helps make everything run really smoothly, so that we can kind of just focus on hitting the target.
Yeah, it's great that you're meeting twice a week. That is better than a lot of organizations, I'll say that. That feedback loop is so important with marketing and sales, because that's really, driving the revenue of the business, right? I mean, that's how you get that in the door. And then customer success is what makes them stay forever. Those are a lot of areas of focus, of course, for the C levels at any company. As far as like for performance marketing, I think, Shannon, you touched on a really important point too, is that data accuracy and that data governance and that data architecture is so critical. And that's where a lot of the small to mid-sized companies I've encountered have issues, right? Because when you're a startup or a small company, you're just trying to drive revenue, right? Any customer that wants to come in and try your product, you're like, absolutely, right? I'll take it. But then they don't always set up their map, their CRM, all their different systems. Because, like on average, a company needs between 12 and 16 marketing softwares in their tech stack alone, just for marketing, let alone sales, right? So making sure you have that data that's not just in these different places, but then having them all thrown together in some kind of analytics and dashboards and reporting that is clean and it matches across systems, and you're not running the same report in two different systems with completely different numbers is critical. And I think that alignment and building those policies is really important for earlier companies, because as you scale, you get more and more complex. And I've always said simplicity leads to scalability. So if you're not starting with that good foundation as a small or medium-sized company, then as you get larger and you realize we have a problem, well, you're going to have to slow down. You're going to have to go through a huge digital transformation project. And I've worked at companies where digital transformation projects can take 3, 4, 5. I've even seen 8 years just to kind of rebuild that tech stack and clean up the data. Now, do they get there? Yeah, but there was a company I was talking to, and I forgot the name right now. I was at a conference, and they told me they just finished their digital transformation project in 2025, and they started in 2018. Okay. So that's over 7 years that they were working on it. So, you don't want to get to, as much as you want your business to get to be that larger scale business, you also don't want it to take 7 years and have to redo everything, because you are slowing down to some extent and spending resources. And at that size, it becomes millions of dollars rather than just taking the time early on to invest in structuring it correctly when you start to grow. So I think that's just an important point for anyone out there who's at a small or medium-sized business. If you feel like, well, our data is not really where it should be, or we're not getting clean reporting, but we'll deal with it later. Right now, we're just trying to grow the business. Sometimes it's better to take a deep breath and say, you can keep growing and scaling, but let's focus on this problem now, where it might only be, 6 months of time. And, we bring someone in who knows what they're doing, or, you bring in someone like me and my team, and we can do that and rebuild things. And then you really are in that situation where you can put your foot on the gas when you find those winners. And that's where you get that exponential growth, when you have those business systems in place and you're empowering all your teams. And then you let your salespeople be the best they can be, your marketers be the best they can be, your op team be the best they can be, your developers building out that product, and you have that good system and flow. And I think that's something that when you're chasing that revenue, sometimes gets lost at the executive level, I've seen.
I think, Will, you make a great point. We spent a lot of time changing systems. Yeah. That's another big one. Yeah. You get just used to one reporting platform, and then it's like, oh, we're going to change to this other one. And I can't tell you, during the year that we did that, it was like we spent the bulk of our time in our meetings asking, where did you get that number from? How did you pull that number? What report did you use? And it was so frustrating, because it's like, can we just, we need to have the right number. We need to all be on the same page. And we were wasting so much time and wasting so much energy discussing which report and which filter and, which was the accurate number. And so it's so helpful, to your point, that everybody's on the same page. You're all using the same tool. The data is clean. Everybody gets behind it, so that those conversations, so then you can really just focus on how do you drive more, and how can we all work better together, instead of wasting time on whose number is right.
And what are the biggest challenges you've seen in keeping data clean? I don't know, of course, it's a huge, very loaded question, but is translating information from meetings, sales reps meetings with clients, or something else? Could you give any kind of hints on that challenge?
I think it's across all, and it's really what you said at the beginning, Will. It's the processes also, right? So if you agree on the same level of detail, or at least on the same content, this is actually what will help. And then also somehow controlling that you do it at the very beginning, because otherwise it's exactly this, these big gaps will be created, because you don't only have the data accuracy, you also have cultural changes often. So for example, I was in different digital transformation projects, and the data accuracy was always the biggest thing, because you have a relevant portion of the organization who doesn't want the tool because they mistake the data tracking with control. And then you have, of course, let's say the star one account manager who has everything perfectly detailed in and enables everything to digitally collaborate and to derive data. And then you have others not putting in even a point. And I think this is really where you need to drive this cultural change so that we see the value of data and that we enable the other functions. This is a little bit the connection to the first question we had. So if you understand what you need also to provide in your role to the others to be able to work, then you see maybe a different value in the data you provide to the system. Because as, for example, we are a global company with too many sales and marketing teams to have, for example, meetings every week, right? So we really depend on big platforms. We depend on data accuracy because otherwise we cannot scale, right? And I think this is really the point to understand where automation can help, where data can help. And then there will be the point of personal interaction. Always there will be a point, but it should not be the regular base, especially if you have so big organizations. And for, let's say, the baseline of collaboration, the data in the systems, especially in CRM systems, should be sufficient to understand the status, to understand where maybe there's a red traffic light and so on. And then you can interact. And then also what we saw, what helped a lot really to pull out these data in each and every C-level management review to give the attention to it. And then people also understand that it's not only something you need to do because you need to do it, because it really has a relevance to steer the business and to steer the company.
And I think Sage is a global company as well. And we've also acquired different companies along the way. And so we still have that massive challenge around from a data perspective is certain of our products are in a different platform, are in a different CRM platform than other products. And so again, it comes back to sometimes some teams, our marketing teams can get our data and analytics from one platform. But then when you try to kind of marry that up with what the sales team is using, then there's kind of a disconnect and those platforms don't connect. And so I think it gets really challenging as you get into a larger organization, definitely when you have multiple products and you have products and sales teams working in different CRMs. Will, you talk about digital transformation. I know Sage has been trying to do that of trying to get kind of every single product kind of onto GMO, but it's a big challenge and takes a lot of effort and teams to kind of come together and transfer all of that kind of data over. But we're slowly getting there, and it's gotten better over the years. But it definitely can be a challenge when you're not completely synced up.
Yeah, and that's a common challenge, especially with larger companies when they make an acquisition, is obviously the company that they acquired isn't going to line up with their data practices, even if they have the best ones in the world and everything's on point within their own ecosystem. I think one of the big things just within those companies is having that governance rule. So there's certain just like best practices that I've always enforced anywhere I've worked, or if I come in, as consulting, I'm like, if we don't have best practices in place, we have to establish them. One of the things is you want to make sure that you're not using a text field unless you absolutely have to. Right. Those are the worst from a data perspective as far as you scale. Also just naming conventions, right? Little things like certain systems spelling out the word California or Florida or New York versus using the abbreviation. Those can become very cumbersome when you have 16 different systems all doing it differently, right? So just establishing basic data governance rules like that as far as the properties and property types used in certain situations can help a lot. And then you also just have to have the alignment between the systems. So sometimes you can use third-party tools that you kind of pass things through when you're putting it into a data lake on the larger scale. If you're using some tool like that, where you kind of transform it all into one consumable form for each system, that usually takes a fair amount of time to set up. But once you have it in place, then it's a lot easier to maintain. The other way is just kind of making sure you're enforcing those rules across properties. So if you have a specific product line, maybe they have custom fields that are specific to that product, and we just pass those through to the other systems from any BI tool, if you're using like Power BI, Clipfolio, Adobe Measure, things like that. But if you have fields like state or, phone number, even things like that, or any type of maybe sales notes or sales qualifying questions that are just general, right? Like, what's your annual budget, or what's your budget for this project? Those should all be standardized, whether you're using specific data like dollar range values. Oh, my budget is $1,000 to $5,000, right? Or 10,000 to 25,000, or whatever makes sense. But making sure you kind of establish those, and you're as consistently as possible. Because granted, it's never going to be 100%. There's always going to be a unique situation, a unique product. But as long as you kind of have these rules of this is how we capture data, and we have a standardized process behind it, I think that's one of the critical things for companies to establish, and it's often overlooked, is making sure every team, every department, whether you have different regional sales teams, different product sales teams, however you're organized, different marketing teams, when you're entering data into the system, there needs to be kind of this company philosophy of this is how we do it. And then there's always, and that'll cover 90, 95% of cases. And then you can always manage the outliers in, those unique circumstances. That's for the data team, the BI team, whatever, you're calling them at your organization, to kind of review and kind of deal with those outliers. But having that governance behind it is super critical. And as I kind of said before, if you can establish that early on in a company, it makes it so much easier, because then when you are bigger and you acquire a company, you say, boom, well, this company has these properties. We just need to transform them into our established rule set. And it's a much easier process to integrate that company into your existing tech stack.
And who usually champions that governance in companies? Are data officers or?
Yeah, it can vary. Sometimes it'll be like there'll be a data science team that might create that governance. I've had my positions, as a marketer, I've governed a lot of that, because marketing a lot of times at organizations, particularly small, mid-sized ones, kind of takes over some of the data responsibilities when they're not large enough to really have that BI team, because sales is focused on closing the deal. Sales wants to see data, but most salespeople, let's be frank, they don't want to play around and work with data. That's not what gets them out of bed in the morning, right? But a lot of marketers, especially marketing operations people, that's part of what we do. I consider myself a bit of a data nerd in that regard, but I'm not wearing my glasses at the moment, but normally I would just go. But yeah, I think it varies with the organization. I think it's also a collaborative effort though, because like one other issue that kind of comes into play is a lot of times you might have, just for common example, is your Marketo or Map admin is not the same person as your Salesforce or CRM admin. And they might have different philosophies. And if they're not meeting, even if you're in a certain organization, maybe you're just too large, too many dispersed teams to have regular like sales and marketing syncs. But if your admins of those systems are not collaborating, and, a lot of times like the CRM might be owned by IT and the Map is owned by marketing, and IT doesn't really want to meet with marketing or vice versa, they need to collaborate on how are we managing this process, whether even if it takes the CMO or CEOs to sit them down in a room and say, you two get along, kind of like a parent. But you need to make sure that they're aligned, because that is one of the biggest problems organizations will have, is when you have different admins that aren't collaborating, and then you try to sync up the data in a third party, let's say, like a Power BI. And then all of a sudden, all these fields are different and different things, and they're being captured in different ways, and they're different field types. And then you need to go through a huge process of transforming the data into your data lake in order to make it consumable at that large level, because otherwise, that's how, Shannon, you mentioned you ran into, you get reports where it's like, these are supposed to be the same reports, but the numbers are completely different. And then it's like, most likely both of them are wrong, right? It's not even like one's probably right, one's probably wrong. Most likely both of them are wrong. So I think that's kind of that process. But that, again, is something you have to figure out in an organization, right? Where should that live? What makes sense for us as a company based on our size? Maybe early on marketing owns it when you're a small company. And as you grow, you start to get a data team, and then you kind of migrate that over to them. But as long as you're collaborating with those admins within the departments, because customer success is going to have customer data in whatever, CS platform they're using that might not be in marketing, might not be relevant for marketing to even know, but it's going to sit in some report somewhere, right? So we want to make sure that they're still following those best practices of, are they using text fields for things that should be checkboxes or drop downs or things like that? So just following those best practices across the board, and then making sure your admins across the systems are at least communicating with how they're managing those tools is going to be critical to the long-term success of those organizations and those data, so that when the CEO says, I want to see this number, and it's a number you're like, we don't have a report on that. You're not just guessing and pulling things and pulling your hair out a lot of the times trying to get that information, because, CEOs love to ask random questions sometimes.
And always last minute.
And it's always urgent. Yeah. Before we discussed the importance of having OKRs and the importance of aligning with a larger goal. And I would love to hear what happens when things go unplanned, when you are not hitting the number. when you need to make changes, from the top, and that impacts all the OKRs. What happened with the culture, with collaboration? How have you experienced those crises in your experience?
It can get really toxic really fast when something like that happens. I think I've been in certain instances where, red alerts, drop everything, we're not hitting the number, we're trending to not hit the number for this month and then that quarter. But again, I think it comes from the top down. We've got some great leadership, and so if they kind of come to the table in more of a calm fashion instead of or pointing fingers. I've been in organizations where, it instantly goes to, throwing marketing under the bus. And then marketing's like, well, it's not us, it's sales, or it's, this other team. And I think that's not helpful at all. So I think it has to come from the top down of, yes, this is important. Yes, we're not hitting our number and we need to do something about it right now. But I think it's just, again, showing that kind of collaboration, that empathy, that collaboration of, again, we kind of get all the stakeholders together in a room and in a meeting and go, okay, this is what's happening. Like, marketing, what do you think that is the problem? Like, what do you think you can do to help kind of drive more leads this month, right? And then it's the BDR team. Like, are there any things that you can do to incentivize the team, spiffs or contests or things like that, to really get the team motivated to start dialing and getting those qualified leads over to sales, and then it's sales. What can you do? So again, it's bringing everyone together, and in each of your function, what can you do to step it up to try to kind of make up the gap and hit that number? But I can say one thing is, yeah, the finger pointing and the throwing teams under the bus is not a great way to get anyone motivated to work harder and to kind of push the needle. So again, it has to come from leadership and their message to all the teams.
Jasmine, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think one point is, and this is hard, sometimes we need to learn that we won't achieve a target. And this is something which in the organizations we want to avoid always, but then it's not a target, right? So it's not always a given that we achieve a target. This is exactly the point. I think and this is a leadership point and a cultural point. If we understand we are in this together, we are currently in a challenging environmental situation, or we have a challenging economic situation, we have everyday news who can turn the world upside down. We are in this together and we want to be successful together. So I think it's exactly this, to develop the organization as a learning organization, right? As you said, Shannon, it's important to understand why. What can we do? Where can we influence? Where sometimes we can't. Maybe we need to shift our strategy. And I think this is exactly the point also where data can again help, right? Because it's a neutral player in this, and not only, if sales is not selling, it's often the same story to say, okay, the prices are too high, right? Regardless of the industry I was working, pricing was always the top. If this is not coming, this is the point. But if you look a little bit, what did we lose? Why do we lose? What is the point? What can we do? Maybe sometimes we can't, because competition is catching up and we are not able to jump in. And I think this is really then a base we have together, and then we can develop a plan, again, including functions. But I fully agree with you, Shannon, this finger pointing doesn't lead to anywhere. And this is again a leadership topic, also really to stop it if it starts at all, and not to make it happen also from the very high levels.
Yeah, and I think just as far as some of the finger pointing, because you see that probably at every organization at some point or another, I think that really also comes from the executive or leadership team. It's having a philosophy of, it's okay to point out if there's an issue or a problem, but if you're not going to at least offer some kind of constructive solution, then that's really got to kind of be the rule at any organization, I believe. Because like, it's easy to just say, oh, this is broken, fix it. Or like, if it's a simple fix, that's one thing, if it's a technical issue, right? But if you're saying, oh, marketing isn't qualified or isn't giving me enough good leads, well, what's the feedback? What are you hearing from those people that is making them not qualified leads or not interested, right? If they're not giving you some kind of solution, and likewise with sales, right? If the sales team, if you think these leads are qualified and they're not closing these deals, well, why are you not closing this deal? Are you prepared with the right sales notes or the right topics? Are you, getting the right identifying the right problems that we have a solution for, right? As far as our product. So I think it's about having that open line of communication is key, but making sure that from a leadership perspective, you're training your teams to be constructive about it, right? It's okay to identify an issue or say the leads that came in from this campaign were really bad. Well, maybe it was something about the messaging. Oh, well, what I was hearing from these people on the phone calls I had with them was, we were advertising this, but they were really interested in that, right? So maybe then marketing can go back and adjust the campaign, or maybe they decide, look, this wasn't a good target. Let's put our ad dollars elsewhere, right? But getting that positive feedback and understanding that there is a lot of, effort that goes into everything everyone does in an organization. So when you come in and the leadership team, if you are someone who's listening out there who has, a team under you, and you identify a lot of what I'd call problem identification without a solution, then that would probably be something where it's on you to kind of coach your team to be more of a constructive feedback loop to whatever department, whether it's, the data's messy. Well, don't just say the data's messy. Go to the analytics team and say, hey, I need this type of information in this format. How can we get there? Right? Rather than just saying, all my numbers are wrong and this doesn't make any sense and the data's broken. Well, that doesn't help anyone. Right? So you need to work with those teams, whether you're someone who's leading a team and coaching them on how to interact cross-functionally, or if you are an individual out there who's dealing with that, just having that mindset when you're working with other departments that, hey, they're working hard too. Everyone's on the same team. When you're at an organization, the philosophy has got to be everyone's on board. We're all trying to reach the same goal. We're all trying to grow the company. We're all trying to hit our numbers. And if that's not the philosophy, then that's a culture problem within the company. And that's a larger issue than just fixing some data points is ever going to solve.
And I think one of the things that we've started to look at is, shadow a sales call. Or if they record the calls, listen to the calls. And so now it's going to start to become a mandate, at least on my team, that, I need you to be listening to 3 sales calls a quarter, or sit in on one. Because again, that's extending that collaboration and that empathy of how hard it is for sales. I didn't get into sales because I have no interest in that, but that looks really hard for me. And so I think, again, it helps that collaboration. We're all in this together. And so if marketing can have a better idea of those conversations that sales is having with the leads that we're sending over, that can give us some more insights into, okay, you know what, maybe I need to change up the messaging, or, maybe I need to make some changes to the landing page because maybe X, Y, and Z aren't clear from the questions and the conversations that sales is having with those marketing leads that are being driven in. So again, I think it just doing those small little things helps to kind of build that collaboration, that empathy, and that kind of synergy within the teams, so that we understand how hard each of our jobs are of kind of getting to that end goal.
Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Shannon, Jasmine, Will, for such thoughtful and honest insights. And for our audience, if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and check out other episodes on how modern B2B teams are evolving. Until next time, thank you so much.